Dust settled over the cobblestones of Oakhaven Square, thick and suffocating under the midday sun. Chains rattled against the ancient whipping post, a metallic, jarring sound that would haunt Abigail Foster for the next 2 decades. She was only 7 when she defied the entire town, creeping past the armed militia to press a dented tin cup of water to the parched, cracked lips of a monster. They called him a demon, a creature of the night destined to turn to ash at sunrise. He called himself Sutton. 20 years later, that same decaying town would bow to him, and Abigail would be forced to wear his crown. Oakhaven was a town built on secrets and shadowed valleys, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills where cell service died and old superstitions thrived. It was the autumn of 2006 when the local militia, led by the ruthless Mayor Thomas Harding, dragged the creature into the town square. They had hunted him for 3 nights. The locals had whispered of a predator in the woods, a man who moved faster than a striking viper and possessed eyes that glowed like dying embers. Harding, a man desperate to cement his authority over a populace fearful of the dark, had laced the local deer carcasses with liquid silver and a synthetic neurotoxin procured from a private laboratory downstate. It was a cowardly tactic, but it worked. Sutton Blake, an apex predator who had walked the earth for centuries, had fed on the tainted blood, his immortal system thrown into violent, agonizing shock. Now, he was bound. Thick, iron chains forged by the town's blacksmith under Harding's strict, paranoid orders wrapped tightly around Sutton's torso, arms, and throat, pinning him to the stone pillar in the center of Oakhaven. His head hung low, black hair matted with sweat and dirt, obscuring his face. His bespoke tailored suit, an anomaly in this rugged timber town, was torn and stained. Citizens gathered on the wooden porches of the general store and the post office, and their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound terror. Harding stood on the steps of the municipal building, a megaphone in his hand, though his booming voice hardly needed it. "Let this be a testament," Harding roared, his face flushed with the thrill of victory. "No beast, no matter how ancient, stands above the law of Oakhaven. We leave him here tonight. When the sun breaches the eastern ridge tomorrow, we will watch the light purge this evil from our land." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Evelyn Foster held her 7-year-old daughter, Abigail, tightly against her hip. Evelyn's hands were rough from years of manual labor, but her grip was protective, almost painful. "Don't look at him, Abby," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling as she pressed the girl's face into her worn denim jacket. "He's a trickster, a devil," but Abigail peeked anyway. She saw a man, not a monster. She saw the way his broad chest heaved, fighting for air against the heavy iron crushing his ribs. She saw the deep, bleeding lacerations where the silver had burned into his pale skin. And more than anything, she noticed his lips cracked, bleeding, and desperately dry. Hours bled into a chilling night. The townspeople, satisfied with the spectacle and eager to escape the dropping temperatures, retreated to their homes. Harding posted 2 guards, Deputy Hayes and a local drunk named Miller, to keep watch, though both men quickly found solace in a flask of cheap whiskey to ward off the unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from the chained man. By midnight, the guards were asleep, slumped against the wooden barrels near the hardware store. In the small, drafty cabin at the edge of town, Abigail lay awake. The rattling of the chains echoed in her mind. She didn't understand the complex lore of vampires or the deep-seated hatred the town held for the unknown. She only understood that a man was hurting, and he was thirsty. Slipping out from under her patchwork quilt, Abigail crept into the kitchen. She bypassed the noisy sink and went straight to the old water pump on the back porch. Pumping it quietly, she filled a dented tin cup to the brim. The air was frigid, biting through her thin cotton nightgown, but she moved with a quiet determination born of pure, unadulterated empathy. The town square was a cemetery of shadows. Abigail navigated the cobblestones with bare feet, careful not to make a sound. When she reached the pillar, the sheer size of the man terrified her. He was massive, a statue of scarred marble in the moonlight. Sutton sensed her before he heard her. Even through the agonizing haze of silver poisoning, his senses picked up the erratic, rapid heartbeat of a child. He slowly lifted his heavy head. His eyes, a mesmerizing shade of deep, predatory crimson, locked onto her. Abigail froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The tales of monsters tearing throats out flashed through her young mind, but she forced her feet to remain planted. "Water," her small voice squeaked, piercing the heavy silence. She held up the tin cup with trembling hands. Sutton stared at her. For 300 years, humanity had offered him nothing but fire, stakes, and fear. This fragile, tiny creature stood before him, reeking of fear, yet offering salvation. His throat was a desert of glass. He couldn't speak, the iron chain pressing tightly against his larynx. He merely tilted his head forward, a silent plea and a submission to her mercy. Abigail stepped up onto the stone base of the pillar. She had to stand on her tiptoes, her small hands shaking as she brought the rim of the cup to his lips. Sutton drank. It was just water, plain and metallic tasting from the tin, but to him, it was the purest nectar. It cooled the burning in his throat and provided a momentary lapse in his endless torment. When the cup was empty, she pulled it back. Sutton let his head fall back against the stone, his eyes closing for a brief moment. When he opened them again, the crimson had faded into a softer, human-like amber. "Why?" he rasped, his voice a deep, gravelly whisper that vibrated in her chest. "You looked sad," Abigail replied simply, clutching the cup against her chest. "And thirsty." Sutton studied her face, memorizing the shape of her eyes, the scattering of freckles across her nose, and the unique, sweet scent of her blood, a scent that carried the innocence of lilacs and summer rain. "What is your name, little bird?" "Abigail." Abigail, he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a sacred vow. "Go home, Abigail. Forget what you saw tonight. But know this, a Blake never forgets a debt." Footsteps crunched in the distance. One of the deputies was stirring. Panic flashed in Abby's eyes. "Run," Sutton commanded softly. Abigail scrambled off the stone base and sprinted back into the shadows, clutching the empty tin cup. She didn't look back. The next morning, the town gathered at dawn to watch the monster burn. Mayor Harding stood proudly, waiting for the first rays of the sun to hit the pillar. But when the light broke over the ridge, it illuminated nothing but empty, shattered chains. The iron links had been snapped like brittle twigs. The creature was gone, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and crushed stone. Harding was furious, tearing the town apart in a frantic search, but Sutton Blake had vanished into the ether. 20 years is a long time for a human, but a mere blink for an immortal. By 2026, Oakhaven was a ghost of its former self. The timber mill, the town's primary source of income, had mysteriously burned down in 2010. The state routed the new highway 50 miles south, cutting Oakhaven off from commerce. Businesses shuttered, windows were boarded up, and a suffocating blanket of poverty fell over the valley. Through it all, Mayor Thomas Harding maintained his iron grip. He had transformed from an arrogant politician into a tyrannical warlord of a dying kingdom. He owned the local bank, the remaining grocery store, and the police force. If you lived in Oakhaven, you lived under Harding's thumb. Abigail Foster was 27, and the heavy toll of life in Oakhaven was etched into her posture. She worked double shifts at Beatrice's diner, pouring burnt coffee for bitter locals, her dreams of college and escaping the valley long buried under piles of medical bills. Her mother, Evelyn, had fallen ill with a severe respiratory disease 5 years ago. The medication was exorbitantly expensive, and Harding's bank had threatened foreclosure on their small cabin more times than Abigail could count. Yet, despite the crushing weight of her reality, Abigail survived. She was tough, practical, and possessed a quiet grace that drew the attention of many men in town, though she entertained none of them. Her heart was guarded, focused solely on keeping her mother alive. But there were strange things in Abigail's life, anomalies she couldn't explain. When she was 18, the local loan shark, a vicious man named Garrett, who had threatened to break her mother's legs over a debt, simply disappeared. The police found his car abandoned by the river, the interior clawed to ribbons, but no body was ever recovered. The debt vanished with him. When she was 21, during the worst blizzard in a century, the power grid failed. Abigail and Evelyn had huddled together, preparing to freeze to death. But when Abigail opened the front door the next morning, she found a cord of perfectly chopped, dry firewood stacked on the porch, alongside a heavy thermal blanket. No tracks in the snow, no note. And every year, on the anniversary of the night the town chained the monster, Abigail would find a single, flawless white rose resting on the windowsill of her bedroom. She never told anyone about the roses. Deep down, a primal instinct warned her that acknowledging the gift out loud would break the spell. She often thought back to that night 20 years ago. The crimson eyes, the deep voice promising a debt repaid. As she grew older, the memory felt more like a fever dream than reality. Monsters didn't exist. Vampires were Hollywood fiction. The man in the square was probably just a deranged drifter. Earth to Abby, Beatrice's sharp voice cut through her reverie. The diner owner, a stout woman in her 60s with a permanent scowl, snapped her fingers over the counter. "Table 4 needs a refill," and Harding's goons just walked in. "Look busy." Abigail grabbed the coffee pot, her jaw tightening. Deputy Hayes, older, fatter, and meaner than he was 20 years ago, slid into a booth with a younger recruit. Hayes always looked at Abigail with a sickening mixture of lust and contempt. "Morning, Abby," Hayes sneered, slamming his hand on the table. "Heard your mom took a turn for the worse. Shame. Harding says the bank's running out of patience with your mortgage. Might be time to consider alternative arrangements." Abigail poured the coffee, her expression a mask of stone. The payment will be there by Friday, Hayes. Tell the mayor not to lose sleep over it. Hayes chuckled, adding 4 packets of sugar to his cup. Suit yourself, but big things are happening in Oakhaven today. Harding's finally selling off the municipal debts. Some big-shot billionaire is coming to town to sign the papers. By tomorrow, Harding's going to be richer than God, and folks like you. Well, you'll be out on the street. Abigail walked away without a word, her heart sinking. If Harding sold the town's debt to a private conglomerate, they would undoubtedly foreclose on all the delinquent properties to clear the land. Her mother's house would be the first to go. She retreated to the break room, leaning against the cold tile wall, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a tear slip down her cheek. She was so tired of fighting. Unbeknownst to Abigail, the billionaire arriving in Oakhaven was not coming to save Mayor Harding. He was coming to destroy him, and he was coming for the girl who gave him water. A fleet of black vehicles cut through the dense autumn fog rolling over the valley. At the helm was a customized sippet-tinted windows obscuring the predator inside. Sutton Blake sat in the luxurious leather seat, nursing a glass of dark, thick liquid that was most definitely not wine. He wore a charcoal, 3-piece bespoke suit that cost more than the entire net worth of Oakhaven. On his finger rested a heavy signet ring bearing the Blake family crest, a wolf devouring a serpent. He had not aged a single second in 20 years. His jawline was sharp enough to cut glass, his dark hair immaculately styled, and his eyes. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, concealing the amber predatory gaze beneath. "We are approaching the municipal building, Mr. Blake," his driver, a loyal familiar named Arthur, announced through the partition. "Excellent," Sutton murmured, his voice smooth and cold. "Have the legal team prepare the acquisition documents. I want Harding stripped of every asset, public and private, by sunset." Sutton had spent the last 2 decades orchestrating Oakhaven's demise. He had manipulated state politicians to reroute the highway. He had systematically purchased the town's debts through dozens of shell companies under the umbrella of Ethelgard Holdings. He had starved the town, watching from the shadows as Harding grew desperate, suffocating in the trap Sutton had meticulously laid. Revenge was a dish best served over decades. But destroying Harding was only half of the objective. The other half resided in a rundown diner on Main Street. Abigail. Sutton had watched her grow. He was the one who tore the loan shark, Garrett, limb from limb, and buried him in the deep woods. He was the one who dragged a cord of wood through a blizzard so she wouldn't freeze. He had protected his investment, honoring his debt in silence, waiting for the girl to become a woman. The Maybach glided to a halt in front of the town hall. Mayor Harding, flanked by a nervous Sheriff Miller and an entourage of local officials, stood on the steps, practically salivating at the sight of the luxury cars. Harding was older now, his hair thinning, his belly protruding, but the greedy glint in his eyes remained identical to the night he ordered Sutton chained. Sutton stepped out of the car. He towered over the men, radiating an oppressive aura of power that made the temperature in the square noticeably drop. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were currently a striking, normal shade of hazel, a simple glamour he used for corporate dealings. "Mr. Blake." Harding rushed forward, extending a sweaty hand. "Welcome to Oakhaven. We are absolutely thrilled to finalize this partnership. Your investment will revitalize this town." Sutton did not take the offered hand. He stared down at Harding, a cruel, imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "I am not here to partner, Mayor Harding. I am here to purchase. Everything." Harding swallowed hard, pulling his hand back awkwardly. "Yes, of course. Right this way to my office. The paperwork is ready." The meeting was brutal and short. Sutton's legal team presented documents that proved Harding's deep financial insolvency. Harding had borrowed heavily from unseen creditors to maintain his lifestyle, not realizing all those creditors funneled back to Ethelgard Holdings. Sutton didn't just buy the town's debt. He bought Harding's personal debts. "Sign the deed to the town, the bank, and your properties over to Ethelgard," Sutton commanded smoothly, leaning over the mahogany desk. "Or my lawyers will have you indicted for embezzlement and fraud by tomorrow morning. You will rot in a federal penitentiary." Harding's face turned ashen. He was trapped. With a trembling hand, the tyrant of Oakhaven signed his empire away to the devil he failed to kill 20 years ago. "Pleasure doing business," Sutton said, stepping back from the desk. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, Mr. Harding. After that, you are trespassing on my land." Leaving the shattered mayor behind, Sutton exited the building. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the very square where he had once bled. He paused, his gaze drifting to the stone pillar that still stood as a grim monument. "Sir, shall we return to the hotel in the city?" Arthur asked, holding the car door open. No, Sutton replied, adjusting his cuffs. There is one final piece of business I must attend to, personally. He walked down Main Street, the clicking of his Italian leather shoes the only sound in the quiet evening. He stopped in front of Beatrice's diner. The neon sign buzzed erratically, casting a red hue over the cracked sidewalk. Sutton pushed the door open. The little bell chimed. The diner was mostly empty. A few locals sat in booths, nursing cold food. But Sutton's eyes immediately locked onto the woman wiping down the counter. Abigail, she was more beautiful than his watchers had reported. The exhaustion around her eyes couldn't hide the fierce intelligence and resilience that radiated from her. Her dark hair was pulled up in a messy bun, a stray curl falling across her cheek. She looked up at the sound of the bell. When her eyes met his, Sutton felt an ancient, dormant part of his soul jolt awake. The blood in his veins, usually cold and still, hummed with sudden electricity. Abigail froze, the damp rag slipping from her hand to slap against the linoleum counter. She didn't recognize the billionaire suit. She didn't know about Ethelgard Holdings. But as Sutton approached the counter, the ambient lighting in the diner seemed to dim around him. He took off his sunglasses. In the shadow of the brim, his glamour slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of deep, predatory crimson. A memory slammed into Abigail's mind with the force of a freight train. Chains, the moon, a tin cup. She gasped, taking a stumbling step backward until her back hit the coffee machine. Sutton stopped at the counter. He looked at her with a terrifying mixture of reverence and absolute possession. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a single, flawless white rose, laying it gently on the scratched Formica counter. "Hello, little bird," Sutton said, his voice a low, vibrating purr that sent shivers straight down her spine. "I believe I owe you for a drink." The diner plunged into a suffocating silence, broken only by the erratic humming of the neon sign outside. Abigail stared at the white rose on the counter, its pristine petals a stark contrast to the grease-stained Formica. Her mind spun, desperately trying to reconcile the terrifying chained behemoth from her childhood nightmares with the immaculate, imposing billionaire standing before her. "You," Abigail breathed, the word barely escaping her throat. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "You're the man from the square. But that was 20 years ago. You haven't aged a day." Sutton offered a faint, enigmatic smile. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his amber eyes, though when he looked at her, the harshness in his features softened. "Time is a luxury afforded to some and denied to others, Abigail. I told you a Blake never forgets a debt. I have spent 2 decades ensuring that when I returned to Oakhaven, no one would ever be able to chain me or threaten you again." Beatrice, who had been watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes from the kitchen pass-through, dropped a stack of ceramic plates. The shattering sound broke the spell. "Abby," Beatrice stammered, backing away. "Who is this?" Sutton didn't even glance at the older woman. He reached into his tailored jacket, produced a sleek black titanium card, and placed it next to the rose. "For the damages, and for Abigail's immediate resignation." "I can't resign," Abigail snapped, her survival instincts kicking in. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the gritty realism that had kept her alive this long. "I have medical bills. I have a mortgage that Mayor Harding is threatening to foreclose on tomorrow. I don't have time to play games with, whatever you are." "Thomas Harding no longer owns your mortgage," Sutton stated, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "As of 20 minutes ago, Ethelgard Holdings acquired Oakhaven Municipal Bank, along with every outstanding debt in this valley. I own it all." Abigail's breath hitched. "You bought the town? I bought the cage they kept you in," he corrected gently. "And now, I am dismantling it. Your mother's medical debt is erased. The mortgage is cleared. The deed to your cabin is fully in your name, free and clear." He gestured toward the diner door, where his driver, Arthur, was waiting patiently by the Maybach. "My private physician, Dr. Harrison Caldwell, is currently arriving at your home," Sutton continued, stepping closer. The faint scent of sandalwood and ozone washed over her. "He is the foremost specialist in respiratory degradation on the eastern seaboard. He has a mobile intensive care unit, and he is preparing to transport Evelyn to a private, state-of-the-art facility in Boston. But we need your consent, Abigail." Tears, hot and unbidden, welled in Abigail's eyes. For 5 years, she had fought a losing battle against a healthcare system designed to bankrupt her, watching her mother slowly fade away in a drafty cabin. Now, this impossible man was offering her the world on a silver platter. "Why?" she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "All for a cup of water?" Sutton reached out, his long, cold fingers gently brushing the tear from her jawline. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "In 300 years of darkness, little bird, you were the only one who offered me light," Sutton murmured. "A cup of water to a dying man is an ocean." Come with me. Abigail didn't hesitate. She untied her grease-stained apron, tossed it onto the counter, and picked up the white rose. As she walked out of Beatrice's diner and stepped into the plush interior of the Maybach, she knew she was crossing a threshold from which she could never return. The old Blackwood estate, an abandoned Victorian mansion perched on the highest ridge overlooking Oakhaven, had been secretly renovated by Aethelgard contractors over the past 6 months. Now, it served as Sutton's temporary fortress. Abigail sat in the opulent library, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of Darjeeling tea. An hour ago, she had watched in stunned silence as Dr. Caldwell, a brilliant, no-nonsense surgeon, had safely stabilized her mother and loaded her into a medical transport helicopter. Evelyn was finally safe. For the first time in a decade, the crushing weight on Abigail's chest had vanished, but a new, different kind of anxiety had taken its place. Sutton stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the dark valley below. He had removed his suit jacket, the charcoal waistcoat highlighting the broad, muscular lines of his back. "She will be comfortable in Boston," Sutton said without turning around. "The facility is entirely funded by my trust. You may visit her whenever you wish. I have arranged a private jet on standby at the county airstrip. I don't know how to repay you," Abigail said, her voice small in the cavernous room. Sutton finally turned, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "You already have. Your debt is paid, Abigail. You are a free woman. You can leave Oakhaven tomorrow and never look back." The thought of leaving the very thing she had dreamed of for years suddenly felt hollow. She looked at Sutton, this ancient, terrifying creature who had moved mountains just to ensure she smiled. Before she could speak, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. Arthur, usually a picture of stoic composure, stepped in, his expression grim. "Sir," Arthur said, his voice clipped, "we have a situation. Perimeter alarms have been breached. It appears Mayor Harding did not take kindly to his eviction." Sutton's jaw clenched. "How many?" 24 men. Local militia and the remnants of the corrupt police force. They are heavily armed. And, sir," Arthur hesitated, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his face, "they brought the silver darts. Harding kept the formula from 20 years ago." Abigail's blood ran cold. She remembered the deep, oozing burns on Sutton's chest when he was chained to the pillar. "Stay here," Sutton commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural register. The glamour hiding his true nature shattered completely. His amber eyes bled into a luminescent, predatory crimson. His skin paled, the veins beneath his eyes darkening. He looked like death incarnate. "Sutton, no." Abigail stood up, dropping her tea. "They'll kill you. Harding is insane." "No, little bird," Sutton whispered, flashing her a smile that revealed elongated, razor-sharp canines. "Harding is merely human, and he has just trespassed on my land." Sutton vanished. He didn't run. He simply ceased to be in the room, leaving behind a rush of displaced air that rustled the heavy velvet curtains. Outside, the rain began to fall in heavy, freezing sheets. Mayor Harding, drenched and furious, stood in the courtyard of the Blackwood estate, holding a specialized pneumatic rifle. Beside him, Deputy Hayes nervously gripped a tactical shotgun. They had expected a billionaire's private security firm. They had not expected a massacre. "Fan out," Harding screamed over the thunder. "He's just one man. Find the girl and use her as leverage to get my town back." Suddenly, a scream echoed from the western garden. One of the militiamen was hoisted 20 feet into the air, vanishing into the canopy of an ancient oak tree. A split second later, his rifle clattered to the cobblestones, bent completely in half. "Form a perimeter," Hayes yelled, his voice cracking with panic. They never stood a chance. Sutton moved like a shadow detached from the physical world. He tore through the corrupt men with a brutal, calculated efficiency. He didn't feed, he found their tainted blood repulsive, but he disarmed and incapacitated them with bone-shattering force. Harding spun around, blindly firing a volley of silver-laced darts into the darkness. One of the darts found its mark, grazing Sutton's shoulder as he materialized behind Deputy Hayes. Sutton hissed, the synthetic neurotoxin burning fiercely against his immortal biology. But the pain only fueled his rage. He grabbed Hayes by the throat, lifting the heavy man off the ground with one hand, and threw him through the windshield of an armored SUV. Harding stumbled backward, dropping his empty rifle. The courtyard was littered with groaning, unconscious men. He was alone. Sutton stepped into the dim light of the courtyard lamps. Blood, none of it his own, stained his pristine white shirt. The silver burn on his shoulder hissed and smoked, but he ignored it. He walked slowly toward the terrified mayor. "You," Harding sputtered, falling to his knees in the wet gravel. "You're the demon from the square. It was you. I told you 20 years ago, Thomas," Sutton rumbled, his crimson eyes glowing in the dark. "I would be your end. Sutton reached down, his claws extending, ready to tear Harding's head from his shoulders. "Sutton, stop!" The voice cut through the rain and the roaring thunder. Sutton froze, his hand inches from Harding's throat. He turned his head to see Abigail standing on the grand marble steps of the estate, soaked by the rain, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She had seen him. She had seen the monster. Sutton felt a spike of genuine fear, not of the silver, not of the armed men, but of the look in her eyes. He slowly lowered his hand, releasing Harding. "Arthur," Sutton called out, his voice returning to a smooth human cadence as he suppressed his monstrous features. The driver materialized from the shadows. "Bind the mayor and his men. The state police will be here in 10 minutes with federal indictments for their financial crimes, and this armed assault. Let the human justice system rot him." Sutton turned his back on Harding and walked toward the steps. He looked up at Abigail, expecting her to run from him, just as every human had done for centuries. Instead, Abigail walked down the steps, meeting him halfway in the pouring rain. She reached out, her small, warm hand gently touching the smoking, silver-burned fabric of his shoulder. "You're hurt," she said softly, her eyes holding no fear, only a fierce, protective defiance. "I will heal," Sutton replied, his crimson eyes softening back to amber as he looked down at her. "Come inside," Abigail instructed, slipping her arm around his waist to support his massive frame. "Let me help you." Just like before, as they walked back into the warmth of the manor, leaving the ruined tyrant in the mud behind them, Sutton realized a terrifying truth. He hadn't just returned to Oakhaven to repay a debt. He had returned because the Vampire King had found his queen, and he would burn the rest of the world to ash to keep her safe. Warmth radiated from the massive stone fireplace in the master suite of the Blackwood estate, casting flickering, golden light across the mahogany floors. Abigail knelt on the plush Persian rug, her hands steady despite the surreal nature of her task. Beside her rested a silver surgical tray provided by Arthur. Sutton sat on the edge of the velvet-tufted bed, his ruined dress shirt discarded. The musculature of his chest and arms was like sculpted marble, flawless except for the angry, blackened crater on his left shoulder, where Harding's dart had embedded itself. The synthetic silver neurotoxin was still smoking, an unnatural chemical reaction against his immortal flesh. "This is going to hurt," Abigail warned softly, gripping a pair of sterilized titanium forceps. "I have endured worse." "Abigail," Sutton replied, his voice a low rumble. His eyes, now a calm hazel, watched her face intently, completely ignoring the wound. "You do not have to do this. Arthur is capable. Arthur is securing the perimeter," she countered, her jaw set with a stubborn determination that made the corner of Sutton's mouth twitch upward. "And I owe you. Hold still." She pressed a sterile gauze pad around the burn and dug the forceps into the searing flesh. Sutton didn't flinch, didn't even draw a sharp breath. As she clamped onto the shattered casing of the dart and pulled it free, the metal clinked onto the surgical tray. Almost instantly, the blackened veins around the wound began to recede, the pale skin knitting together at a microscopic, yet visible, pace. Abigail exhaled a shaky breath, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Incredible. Immortality is a resilient design," Sutton murmured, gently taking the bloody gauze from her hands. He captured her fingers in his cold, large grip. "But it is not invincible. 20 years ago, I was nearly broken, not by Thomas Harding, but by the poison that put me in his path." Abigail looked up, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Harding said he poisoned the deer with liquid silver. He thought he outsmarted you." A dark, humorless chuckle escaped Sutton's lips. "Harding is a parasite who stumbled upon a wounded lion. The synthetic silver he used was not procured locally. It was manufactured by Ascension Biomedical, a private pharmaceutical front in Zurich. It belongs to Alistair Croft." The name hung in the air, cold and heavy. Sutton released her hand, standing up to pace in front of the fire. The flames illuminated the ancient, calculating predator lurking just beneath his human facade. "The world you know, Abigail, is merely a tapestry draped over a much older, darker reality. My family, the Blakes, have controlled the North American territories for 3 centuries. We oversee commerce, political shifts, and the enforcement of the laws that keep our kind hidden from humanity. Alistair Croft commands the European Syndicate. He is a purist, a fanatic who believes our kind should subjugate humanity, not hide from it." Sutton turned to face her, his expression grim. 20 years ago, Croft orchestrated a coup. He poisoned my supply lines with that synthetic variant, hoping to destabilize my mind and body so his assassins could finish the job. I retreated to the Appalachian wilderness to purge the toxin from my system. That is when Harding's militia found me. I was paralyzed, starving, and burning from the inside out. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing her cheek. I was prepared to turn to ash against that pillar, and then a little girl with a tin cup gave me the strength to shatter iron. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. The sheer scale of his world was terrifying, yet standing before him, she felt an inexplicable sense of safety. If Croft wanted you dead then, what's stopping him now? Me, Sutton stated, an aura of absolute authority radiating from him. For 20 years, I rebuilt my empire. I hunted down Croft's loyalists on this continent and eradicated them. I secured Oak Haven to ensure you were protected while I dismantled his financial infrastructure. But tonight's incident with Harding will make noise. The local authorities are handled, but Croft has spies everywhere. He will soon know that the Blake King has returned to the very town where he was once chained. And he'll know why, Abigail whispered, a cold dread washing over her. He'll know about me. Sutton's eyes darkened, the hazel flashing crimson. He will try. But to reach you, Alistair Croft will have to wade through an ocean of his own blood. I did not spend 2 decades tearing down a town just to lose you to a rival. Tomorrow, we leave for Boston. You will see your mother, and then you will remain within the walls of my heavily fortified estate. You are under the protection of the Blake crown now. 2 days later, the stark, sterile scent of antiseptic replaced the crisp mountain air of Oak Haven. The Caldwell Blake Research Institute in Boston was a marvel of modern medicine, a towering glass monolith funded entirely by Sutton's endless wealth. The top floor was a private, highly secure wing dedicated solely to Evelyn Foster's recovery. Abigail sat in a plush leather armchair beside her mother's bed. Evelyn was sleeping peacefully, her breathing deep and even, aided by a sophisticated, silent respiratory machine. The color had already returned to her cheeks. For the first time since she was a teenager, Abigail felt the crushing weight of impending grief lift from her shoulders. Her cellular regeneration is responding beautifully to the synthetic oxygen therapy, Doctor. Harrison Caldwell said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the digital chart. He was a brilliant man, entirely aware of his employer's true nature, yet dedicated solely to the science. Mr. Blake spared no expense. She should be awake and communicative by tomorrow evening. Thank you, Dr. Caldwell, Abigail said, her voice thick with gratitude. I can't even begin to express. Save your thanks for the boss, Miss Foster. Caldwell offered a rare, genuine smile before stepping out of the room. Abigail stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The Boston skyline stretched out below her, a glittering grid of lights against the dusk. She was wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and dark trousers, garments provided by Sutton's staff that cost more than her former home. She felt like an imposter in a fairy tale, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. The heavy oak door to the suite opened silently. Sutton stepped in. Even in the clinical environment, he looked like a monarch. He wore a midnight blue suit, his presence instantly commanding the room. He moved to her side, his gaze following hers out over the city. She rests well, he asked quietly. She looks better than she has in years, Abigail replied, leaning slightly into his side. She was surprised by how natural the contact felt, how quickly she had adapted to the gravitational pull of his presence. Sutton, what happens now? I can't stay hidden in a mansion forever. Sutton turned his head, his eyes tracing the curve of her neck. You won't have to. Once Croft is dealt with permanently, you will have the freedom to live whatever life you choose. College, travel, a career. The world is yours. What if the life I choose involves you? She asked, the words slipping out before her rational mind could stop them. Sutton froze. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at her, his expression a complex war of ancient restraint and raw, consuming desire. He raised a hand, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. Before he could answer, the hospital suite plunged into absolute darkness. The low hum of the medical machinery died. The city lights outside the window vanished, leaving only the pale moonlight filtering through the glass. A split second later, the backup generators kicked in, bathing the room in harsh, pulsing red emergency lights. Abigail gasped, instinctively stepping back, but Sutton's arm whipped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. His body was rigid, his muscles coiled like steel springs. EMP, Sutton hissed, his voice dropping to that terrifying, guttural register. His eyes flared a brilliant, furious crimson in the red light. The hospital grid has been fried. The reinforced door to the hallway rattled violently. Arthur, Sutton roared. The door burst open. Arthur stood in the frame, his usually immaculate suit torn, holding a pair of heavy, matte black tactical blades. Sir, it's a breach, dozens of them. They bypassed the biometric scanners. They are heavily armed with incendiary rounds and ultraviolet lasers. It's Croft's elite guard, the Deathstalkers. Secure Dr. Caldwell and lock down the lower floors, Sutton commanded, pushing Abigail behind him. Do not let them reach the lobby. Yes, sir. Arthur vanished down the corridor, the sound of clashing metal and gunfire instantly echoing up the stairwell. Sutton turned to Abigail. The aristocratic billionaire was gone. In his place stood the Vampire King, a predator backed into a corner, ready to unleash hell. His fangs descended, sharp and gleaming. "Listen to me," Sutton said, grabbing her shoulders. "There is a panic room concealed behind the primary surgical theater down the hall. It is lined with 4 feet of lead and titanium. You will go there, and you will not open the door for anyone but me. Do you understand?" "I'm not leaving you," Abigail cried over the rising din of automatic gunfire echoing through the air vents. "And I can't leave my mother. The life support runs on isolated internal batteries. She has 12 hours, Sutton said rapidly, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. "They do not want her, Abigail. They want you. You are the only leverage Croft has against me. If they take you, I lose everything." A heavy explosion shook the building, shattering the glass in the adjacent rooms. Smoke began to drift through the corridor. "Go!" Sutton roared, the sound vibrating in her very bones. Abigail sprinted into the hallway, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her throat. She ran toward the surgical theater, slipping on scattered medical supplies. She glanced back just once. Sutton stood in the center of the corridor, his coat discarded. 3 mercenaries clad in heavy black tactical armor, wielding rifles emitting blinding purple UV light, rounded the corner. Sutton didn't flinch. With a terrifying roar, the Vampire King charged directly into the blinding light, his bare hands tearing through Kevlar and bone as if it were paper. Abigail pushed through the swinging doors of the surgical theater, desperately searching for the hidden panels Sutton had described. But as she reached the back wall, a cold, gloved hand clamped down brutally over her mouth, dragging her into the shadows. The gloved hand over Abigail's mouth tasted of synthetic polymer and gun oil. She was dragged backward with terrifying speed, her heels skidding across the sterile linoleum of the hospital corridor. She thrashed wildly, her elbows connecting with hard, tactical Kevlar, but her captor felt like a wall of solid granite. They burst through the double doors of the primary surgical theater. The room was bathed in the eerie, pulsing red glow of the emergency backup lights. Stainless steel surgical tables gleamed like sacrificial altars. Her captor threw her roughly into a rolling tray of surgical instruments. The metal crashed to the floor in a deafening clatter, sending scalpels and clamps scattering into the shadows. Abigail scrambled backward, her heart hammering violently against her ribs until her spine hit the cold, tiled wall. A spirited little bird, a smooth, cultured voice echoed through the dark room. "It is easy to see why he kept you." A man stepped out of the shadows, illuminated intermittently by the red strobe lights. He was not wearing the heavy tactical gear of the Deathstalkers. Instead, he was dressed in an impeccably tailored, charcoal grey Brioni suit, looking more like a Wall Street executive than a monster. He had pale, sharp features, aristocratic cheekbones, and hair the color of spun silver. "Alistair Croft," Abigail breathed, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. Croft smiled, a chilling, hollow expression. "The very same. I must admit, Miss Foster, your existence was a closely guarded secret. It took my analysts at the Credit Suisse Intelligence Division 6 months to trace the shell corporations Sutton used to buy your insignificant little town." The Vampire King, brought to his knees by a human waitress. "It is almost poetic." "You won't win," Abigail said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror threatening to consume her. "He killed your men 20 years ago. He'll do it again." 20 years ago, Sutton was a feral beast backed into a corner, Croft corrected, pulling a sleek, silver-plated dagger from his suit jacket. The blade hummed with a faint, unnatural energy. Tonight, he has a weakness. You. A massive, concussive boom shook the surgical theater. The heavy, reinforced steel doors buckled inward, groaning under an immense weight. Another deafening crash, and the doors were torn entirely off their hinges, flying across the room to smash into the observation glass above. Sutton stepped through the ruined doorway. He was a vision of absolute carnage. His midnight blue suit was shredded, soaked in the blood of the mercenaries he had dismantled in the hallway. In his right hand, he held a crushed Heckler and Koch submachine gun, which he casually tossed to the floor. His fangs were fully descended, and his eyes burned with a crimson fire so intense it seemed to cast its own light. "Let her go, Alistair," Sutton commanded. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a deep, seismic vibration that rattled the medical instruments on the counters. Croft merely chuckled, stepping behind Abigail. He grabbed a fistful of her dark hair, yanking her head back, and pressed the edge of the humming silver blade against the delicate skin of her throat. "Drop to your knees, Sutton," Croft sneered, all pretenses of civility vanishing, "or I will sever her carotid artery and let you watch the light fade from her eyes. The silver in this blade will ensure she cannot be turned." She will simply die. Abigail gasped as the cold metal bit slightly into her skin. A single drop of warm blood welled up, sliding down her neck. The scent of her blood hit the air. Sutton froze. The monstrous rage radiating from him hit an invisible wall. For 3 centuries, Sutton Blake had bowed to no one. He had slaughtered kings, dismantled empires, and ruled the North American syndicate with an iron fist. But as he looked at the terrified woman who had once offered him a tin cup of water in the freezing dark, the choice was not a choice at all. Slowly, agonizingly, Sutton lowered himself to the blood-stained floor. The vampire king knelt. "Fascinating," Croft whispered, his eyes wide with triumphant disbelief. The great Sutton Blake, surrendering his crown for a mortal. From the ruined doorway, 6 Deathstalkers poured into the room, their weapons trained on Sutton. They didn't use ordinary cuffs. They produced heavily modified tungsten carbide chains, laced with the same synthetic silver neurotoxin from 20 years ago. "Bind him," Croft ordered. "Take him to the roof. The sun rises Castin Sedevins, want him chained to the helipad. He will burn, and you, my dear," Croft whispered into Abigail's ear, "will watch." As the mercenaries wrapped the searing, smoking chains around Sutton's wrists and throat, he didn't fight back. He didn't even look at them. His glowing crimson eyes remained locked onto Abigail's, silently promising her that this was not the end. The wind howling off Boston Harbor was brutal, a freezing, salt-laced gale that whipped across the sprawling concrete roof of the Caldwell Blake Research Institute. High above the sleeping city, the painted yellow H of the helipad served as a grim stage for what Alistair Croft believed would be the final act of a centuries-old rivalry. Sutton was forced onto his knees right in the center of the landing circle. The tungsten carbide chains, thick, heavy, and viciously engineered, were bolted directly into the reinforced steel grating beneath him. The synthetic silver neurotoxin coating the metal hissed upon contact with his pale skin, releasing thin plumes of acrid grey smoke into the frigid night air. His head hung low, his broad shoulders slumped forward. To the untrained eye, he was a broken king, a terrifying echo of the agonizing night in Oakhaven 20 years prior. A few yards away, Abigail struggled against the unyielding grip of a towering Deathstalker mercenary. Her arms were pinned painfully behind her back, her cashmere sweater torn, her breath visible in the freezing air. Panic clawed at her throat, suffocating and sharp. She pulled, kicked, and twisted, but the guard felt like a statue forged of solid iron. She looked at Sutton, her heart shattering at the sight of him bound and bleeding, all because he had chosen to surrender to protect her. Croft stood near the perilous edge of the roof, the wind tearing at his silver hair and impeccably tailored Brioni suit. He looked out at the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, then checked the glowing face of his platinum Patek Philippe watch. A cruel, triumphant smile stretched across his aristocratic features. 10 minutes until dawn, Croft announced, his cultured voice carrying effortlessly over the roaring ocean wind. He turned his back to the horizon and walked slowly over to Sutton, looking down at his captive with a mixture of disgust and absolute victory. "Your syndicate is already falling, Sutton. As we speak, my operatives are seizing your assets from New York to Los Angeles. Your loyalists are being purged. Aethelgard Holdings will be entirely dissolved by noon. Your reign is over." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the howling wind and the nervous rattling of the mercenaries' weapons. Then, Sutton slowly lifted his heavy head. The crimson fire in his eyes had not dimmed in the slightest. If anything, the color was burning hotter, filled with a dark, terrifyingly calm, and calculating malice that made Abigail's breath hitch. He did not look like a man facing his imminent execution. "You always were a short-sighted fool, Alistair," Sutton rasped, his voice a deep, seismic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the concrete beneath their feet. "You think I spent 20 years building an empire just to let it be taken by a coward who hides behind mercenaries?" Croft's eyes narrowed, his triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered his arrogant composure. "Empty threats from a dying man. You are chained, Sutton. The silver is already working its way into your bloodstream. When the sun breaches that horizon, you will be nothing but a memory blowing in the wind." Sutton offered a bloody, razor-sharp smile that sent a chill down Abigail's spine. "Look at the chains, Alistair." Croft frowned, his gaze dropping to the heavy tungsten carbide links binding Sutton's wrists and throat. He squinted in the dim, pre-dawn light. The realization hit him like a physical blow, draining the color from his pale face. They weren't smoking anymore. The initial chemical reaction had ceased entirely, the metal now resting harmlessly against Sutton's unblemished, rapidly healed skin. "The silver," Croft stammered, taking a sudden, involuntary step backward. Panic laced his previously smooth voice. "Why isn't the silver burning you?" "Because," a crisp, authoritative voice echoed from the heavy steel access door leading to the stairwell. The door swung open, and Dr. Harrison Caldwell stepped onto the roof. He was not alone. Flanking the doctor was Arthur, holding his matte black tactical blades, followed by a dozen of Sutton's own elite, heavily armed guards. Their weapons were instantly trained on the Deathstalkers. Caldwell calmly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, entirely unfazed by the standoff. Mr. Blake has spent the last 2 decades undergoing a highly classified, excruciating protocol of microdosing Ascension Biomedical's synthetic silver toxin. He developed an absolute immunity to it 3 years ago. Croft backed away, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He looked at Sutton, finally understanding the depth of his enemy's endless, terrifying patience. "Kill him!" Croft screamed to his Deathstalkers, his voice cracking. "Kill them all!" But Sutton was already moving. With a deafening, explosive crack that shattered the concrete and warped the steel grating beneath him, Sutton flexed his massive arms. The supposedly indestructible tungsten carbide chains, completely devoid of their silver poisoning advantage to weaken him, snapped like brittle, cheap plastic. Fragments of metal rained down on the helipad. Absolute chaos erupted. Arthur and the Blake guards engaged the Deathstalkers in a brutal, lightning-fast firefight that lit up the rooftop in blinding flashes of gunfire. Sutton didn't bother with weapons. He was a primordial force of nature unleashed. He moved faster than the human eye could track, tearing through Croft's elite mercenaries with ruthless, terrifying precision. The towering Deathstalker who had been holding Abigail captive was suddenly yanked backward into the air by an unseen force, thrown clear off the 50-story building to plummet into the dark, freezing waters of the harbor below. Abigail stumbled forward, gasping for breath, her hands flying to her bruised throat as she watched the carnage unfold. Croft, realizing his entire meticulously planned coup had just collapsed into ruin in a matter of seconds, turned and sprinted toward the edge of the roof. He intended to leap to the lower adjacent building, desperate to escape the wrath of the king he had tried to dethrone. He never made it. Sutton materialized directly in his path, an immovable wall of dark fury. "You chained me in the dark, Alistair," Sutton growled. He reached out, grabbing Croft by the lapels of his ruined Brioni suit, and lifted the struggling, panicked syndicate leader entirely off his feet with one hand. "Now, you will face the light." On the eastern horizon, the dark veil of the night finally broke. The first brilliant, piercing ray of the morning sun crested over the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean, casting a golden beam directly across the rooftop. Sutton hurled Croft forward, straight into the path of the unfiltered sunlight. The European syndicate leader screamed a horrifying, agonizing, inhuman sound that echoed over the water. The moment the ultraviolet rays struck his immortal flesh, a violent combustion occurred. Within seconds, Alistair Croft dissolved into a pillar of blinding, white-hot ash. The brutal ocean breeze caught the remains immediately, scattering them into the wind until nothing was left but a charred, empty suit, fluttering uselessly to the concrete floor. The remaining Deathstalkers, witnessing the absolute, terrifying obliteration of their master, immediately dropped their weapons. They fell to their knees on the bloody concrete, bowing their heads in unconditional surrender. The battle was over. The suffocating tension broke, leaving only the sound of the wind and the distant crashing of waves. Sutton stood perfectly still at the very edge of the shadow cast by the hospital's mechanical penthouse, mere inches away from the deadly creeping sunlight. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his shredded, blood-soaked suit. He was covered in the gore of his enemies. In that moment, he looked completely terrifying. He looked exactly like the monster the world believed him to be. Abigail didn't hesitate for a single second. She walked past the kneeling mercenaries, her footsteps steady as she stepped over the shattered remnants of the chains. She moved directly into the shadow with him, eliminating the distance between them. Reaching up, her small, warm hands gently framed his rigid, blood-stained face. Sutton closed his eyes, a shudder running through his massive frame as he leaned into her delicate touch. The monstrous, glowing crimson faded from his eyes, slowly replaced by the warm, deeply human amber she had first seen in a rundown diner. "It's over," Abigail whispered, her thumbs brushing against his cheekbones. "No, little bird," Sutton replied softly. His large, cold hands came to rest gently on her waist, pulling her flush against him. "It is only beginning." 6 months later, the town of Oakhaven was completely unrecognizable. The ruined, decaying husk of a municipality had been entirely revitalized. Ethelgard Holdings had rebuilt the infrastructure from the ground up, paving the roads, restoring the homes, and turning the forgotten Appalachian Valley into a thriving, heavily fortified, and fiercely protected sanctuary for Sutton's centralized operations. The Blackwood estate, perched high on the ridge, was no longer just a temporary fortress. It was a permanent, sprawling palace. Inside the grand ballroom of the estate, thousands of crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled crowd. Sutton stood at the head of the room, looking out over the leaders of the newly unified global syndicate. He wore a pristine, tailored black tuxedo, exuding an aura of absolute, unchallenged power that demanded instant respect. But all eyes in the massive room were fixed on the woman standing beside him. Abigail looked radiant, wearing a breathtaking, sweeping gown of midnight silk that seemed to catch the light with every movement. In the front row of the audience, Evelyn Foster sat in a plush velvet chair, her health fully restored, weeping silent tears of profound joy. Sutton turned his full attention to Abigail. From the inner pocket of his jacket, he produced a small, ancient velvet box. As he opened it, the room collectively held its breath. Inside rested a delicate, centuries-old crown, masterfully forged from blackened platinum and encrusted with flawless crimson diamonds. He stepped closer to her, his amber eyes reflecting a love that had spanned decades and defied death itself. 20 years ago, you brought a dying man water, Sutton said. Though he spoke softly, his voice carried through the utterly silent ballroom, yet the words were meant entirely, exclusively, for her. Tonight, I give you the world. With gentle reverence, Sutton placed the blackened platinum crown upon her head. The entire room erupted into thunderous, respectful applause, every immortal present bowing their heads to acknowledge the new regime. Abigail looked up at Sutton, the terrifying monster from her childhood nightmares who had become her ultimate savior, her fierce protector, and her eternal king. She smiled, a bright, unyielding light in his world of shadows, and stepped into his embrace, fully ready to rule by his side. Abigail Foster's journey from a terrified child clutching a tin cup to the sovereign ruler of a shadowed empire proves that true power does not reside in fangs, immortal strength, or infinite wealth. It resides in the profound, unyielding courage of empathy. When she defied a town's prejudice to show mercy to a monster, she unknowingly altered the axis of a hidden world. Sutton Blake, forged in darkness and betrayal, found his salvation not in revenge, but in the enduring light of her humanity. Together, they shattered the physical and metaphorical chains of their pasts. Oakhaven, once a symbol of cruelty and decay, transformed into a sanctuary of their shared reign. The Vampire King finally found his peace, not by subjugating the light, but by crowning it. 20 years after offering him water, Abigail wore his crown, ruling the night with a mercy it had never known.